Um, you have been working with American Foundation for Suicide Prevention for some time. How did you get involved in it?
Ah, you got me involved in it.
I did.
Um, so I moved to Red Wing, Minnesota in 2016. And when I left Casper, Wyoming, I was very active in suicide prevention in the church.
Uh,
I was working for the Episcopal Diocese of Wyoming at the time.
uh-huh.
And we had started the work of partnering with the state as a partner in suicide prevention. So there was a lot of intersection with faith, spirituality, and suicide prevention and what comes from that. And for me personally, it was because very early into my formation, um, as a leader, even before I went to graduate school and got my master's of divinity, even
Mhm.
before I was on the path to the priesthood, there was a member of our congregation who died by suicide.
Uh-huh.
And I just remember that we did everything right, but we never talked about it. And what I mean is, we did the funeral, we did, we sent him off as best as we could. And then as a congregation, we never talked about suicide. And it dawned on me that, hey, this is part of the blame and shame that comes out of suicide, the
Mhm.
stigma that we've created, and that the church is complicit in it. So
Yeah.
when I was at the Episcopal Diocese of Wyoming, working for the Bishop of Wyoming, we had a long conversation about that.
Mhm.
Uh, so that became a social justice piece for the diocese. And
Mhm.
I brought that to Minnesota when I was here. And some point in late 16, I believe, I Googled suicide prevention Minnesota, and AFSP
Yeah.
Minnesota came up. And I just sent a letter of interest, or, well, filled out the form expressing an interest in
Uh-huh.
learning more. And you and another member came, and we had,
Gloria.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, we had lunch and a long conversation, and then I
Mhm.
was invited to a meeting, and pretty soon I was drinking the Kool-Aid. So I think I joined. Yeah, I remember you saying, "Hey, takes 6 months to join the board. We want to make sure it's right for you," or something
Uh-huh.
like that. So that would be 17-ish when
Yeah.
I actually officially joined the board. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. So thank you for that.
Uh,
And I was
uh,
just elected
uh,
the chair of the AFSP just this past month.
for
So.
Minnesota.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, yes, for Minnesota, not for the nation, but for
So
Minnesota. Yeah,
for the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention for the state of Minnesota.
yes.
Yeah, congratulations. Because
Thank you.
one of the things that I've always experienced when I was in the suicide realm um, was a lot of animosity towards faith
Yeah.
from individuals and listening to a lot of their stories. And I always felt bad because it seemed like they weren't, they took their relationship that they had with another human being and how that person interacted with that suicide, that negative experience for them, and then they connected it directly to God.
Yeah. Yep.
And
Yeah. Good.
it was frustrating for me that healing and a relationship with Creator was not allowed to continue or even develop because of this human to human contact. Because humans, we can be pretty narrow minded in our interpretation of how we think who God is. And so it was rampant in suicide. I know when I went to the conventions, most of my time was just in receiving that pain. But there was also, behind the scenes, there was also more of a hope that they hadn't been yet able to express that, well, maybe, maybe. So rebuilding those relationships, I think, was important for people of faith to be involved in our current suicide prevention. Does that make sense?
It does. And I mean, the work's ongoing, right? You can't undo 2,000 years of false teaching,
Right.
uh, by, you know, being involved in AFSP for however long we're involved, right?
Mm.
Um, and by false teaching, I'm saying the historic teaching of the church. And when I say the church, I'm talking about the global Christian church of suicide is a sin.
Yeah.
Um, and, we just know differently, but it hasn't been communicated differently for very long.
Yeah.
Most, I mean, there are still churches that teach that, and
Mhm.
I don't ascribe to it. I want to say almost all denominations have, all mainline denominations, I can safely say, have backed away from that stance,
Yeah.
and instead recognize that suicide is the ultimate moment of mental health crisis,
Yeah.
and the blame shame that we've offered for 2,000 years is still something that we're fighting.
Yeah. And the fight's going to continue as because we're humans.
Yep.
Yeah. And you're Reverend Tristan English. Let's introduce you to the world because not everybody knows who you are, but you are ordained in the Episcopalian faith,
Yep.
and you now have a new position on the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention Board. So you're probably easily found if someone wanted to reach you after this podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just happily offer my email in case anyone does want to, and that includes people who would love to have a conversation about the intersectionality of faith and suicide and the challenges. But it's T English, that's T English at ILIF ILIFF.edu. T English at ILIF.edu. Is the easiest way to get in touch with me.
And I'll put that into for the people that are watching this. I'll put a link on there for your email too. So thank you. What are some of the crossings of spirituality and suicide? I know in my faith background, dark night of the soul is something that I find that has in common with hopelessness. When you're searching for meaning, searching for reason, but you're still searching. So it's not at that mental acuity where there's no longer searching, because that to me is the cross section for suicide when it's just you're done and there's no more looking.
That's a great question. And I don't have a great answer off the top of my head. I think when it comes to the Christian tradition and mental health, there's a lot at play through the scripture, of course, right? There are many instances of individuals who are having mental health struggles. I think when it comes to suicide, there are two things that stand out for me in terms of scripture, if I can just go this direction with it,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
One is, and God knew us by our name, right? Before we were made, God knew us by our name. So the idea of God knows who we are and everything about us, that for me offers hope in those darkest moments. But that's a me thing. I can't extend that to people
Right.
who may be in that moment. But if I can have a conversation with someone who is at that point and they are wondering where God is,
Mm-hmm.
there is always God in those darkest moments, because God knows all, at least how I ascribe to it. And then, of course, from John, there is, and Jesus wept. And that for me stands out in the world of suicide for those who feel they are broken, right? And there's no better example of the broken human than Christ on the cross, right? You want to talk about someone who understands brokenness. There is that in our tradition. But the "and Jesus wept" for me stands out because there are moments when I have felt intense grief and pain. I am fortunate to have never been to that spot of darkness where I've contemplated suicide, but that's not to say I haven't felt pain and grief. And that is knowing that God, the God that I ascribe to, is both purely human and purely divine, that they have experienced weeping is something. And that for me, and I use that piece quite a bit with families and those who are left behind after suicide. The idea that God knows your pain, because when Jesus was weeping, it was after the loss of a very dear friend in Lazarus, someone that would have been essentially, a chosen family member, right? With Lazarus. And to allow his friend to die and to know that his friend was dead, and his reaction is, and after being railed at by Lazarus's sisters, right?
Yep.
His reaction is to weep. And that for me is just someone who gets us, or right now I'm anthropomorphizing God, but God in human form gets us in that moment. So that for me, and I've done far too many funerals around suicide, I have seen that at least offer a moment of hope and acceptance to those left behind. And that to me affirms what I get out of that.
Yeah. One of the things that I keep, that I've been driven to curiosity about is our division of who we are holistically as a human being, where you have the mental piece, you have the physical piece. And then in the world of psychology, they divide the brain, the psychology, and the mind differently. And then there's this disconnect with the spiritual sides of who we are. And I think all parts of us inform our sense and our struggles. I'm reading a book on PTSD and the effects. And to me, if we didn't have a spirit, why would it bother us, the trauma? Traumatic in itself lends itself to something that is beyond us, that is beyond a physical reaction. But where those lines cross, I don't think that they're lines. I think they're infused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much a spider web, right? There is no disconnect.
And being at the table and offering up our lens of how we see that, as hopefully maybe subject matter experts, or maybe not that, but someone who involves themselves in more of that spiritual religious background more so, and being able to offer it in a different lens is part of, I think, a component that is vital.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I think that there's something at play here that needs to be recognized that both of us feel. I think, right? I don't want to speak for you, but you made it very clear that we may know enough to be slightly dangerous, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
at the same time, we are not individuals that espouse this is what it is,
Right.
or this is what it must be.
Yep.
And that can be a real challenge also when people of little or no faith are working within a denomination that is so dogmatic where it doesn't allow a little bit of grayness, right?
The mystery.
So,
Yeah.
you know, one thing that I like to think about is God gave us everything that we have, right? And part of it is this amazing mind. Um, or and without pulling at those strings that challenge us at time, we're not using the gifts that God fully gave us, right? Because those questions can be so terrifying, but at the end of it, it can be so beautiful as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well said in that the mystery is what things I heard from you. The mysteries in our cognitive, rational, logical world that we live in the 21st century seems to have almost been left out there. Like, we don't need you anymore. But then we get so confused or distraught when we don't acknowledge that there are things that are beyond us.
Yeah, that's fantastic. If I could just riff off that for a second, right? There's a school of thought around counseling called strength-based counseling, which is when you are experiencing something, it doesn't have to be severe, but it's something that, just keeping you up at night, and looking at instances in your life where you have overcome something else that's keeping you up at night. What was there? What were you doing that allowed you to overcome it and come out on a better end? And for me, when it comes to the really big mystical stuff, if we haven't spent time wrestling with those moments, we're not developing the skills that will allow us to come out of the darkness later.
Nailed it.
Yeah. So
when I was going through the military, decided one of their things that they wanted to do to help combat suicide was to teach pivotal people resilience skills. So out of the field of psychology and the field of happiness, psychology were these really resilient skills. And the very first one was gratitude, which is a spiritual practice. You're grateful for whomever, however, and who you give your gratitude to is for you to decide. But there's something that's internal that goes external. And so if we don't practice those things, so for me, it's like I would prefer if people in the spiritual world were at the table to claim that that's something that is beyond us. But we practice every day, and we can't explain necessarily synaptically how it works, but we know it works. So science is still mysterious, but it works. And also, don't avoid those difficult questions like you're talking, is like we really need to be able to wrestle with them, and we don't have to have the answers. It's beautiful not to have the answers. I always struggled with people that, and I think that's probably one of the reasons that the church, got very dogmatic, and it's clear black and white world of what is a sin and what is not a sin, is this need to know and to be able to be an authority. But none of us are an authority. We're all human beings walking a path.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that one thing that I'm surprised I would imagine some of your listeners hearing what you just said are going to say, well, what about the 10 Commandments? They came from God, right? You bet they came from God. The other thing is when Jesus was not rewriting, but revisiting the 10 Commandments.
Challenge.
Yeah, right. Yeah. The two versions of this come out. Love your neighbor as first and
Mhm.
foremost, love God, right?
Right.
They both, you know, they so Matthew, Mark, Luke, John all agree with that. Then it's um, love your neighbor as yourself per Mark, Luke, Matthew.
Okay.
But John is love your neighbor as I have loved you.
Um,
And so this gets into the idea of, for me, right? Jesus is this great example of how we should love the world. So I really like that. But getting back to the idea of what is sin and how did this come about?
mhm.
Well, a lot of this was recorded by man, and God's infallible, but man is definitely not,
Right.
right? So
Right.
there will be mistakes along the way in some of these recordings, folks. So it's okay that,
Right.
there's inconsistencies even within scripture itself.
Yeah. When I was in the military, most of my counseling environment times were with younger folks who hadn't had built up those life experiences,
Mm, yep.
forgive themselves for the stress that they were under. They felt what was coming at them was just life limiting and it was never going to end. And they didn't navigate. They hadn't a skill base on how to navigate those challenges, like we were talking earlier with the dark night of the soul. They hadn't interacted with what does this mean and who am I in it and where do I want to be. And so these resilience skills of practicing gratitude is really them, the University of Pennsylvania, trying to teach people that life experiences are going to happen, failures are going to happen, struggles are going to happen, and these are some skills, if you will, that will help you navigate that. I always wanted them to include the mystery too.
Yeah.
We don't get to have all the answers, and that forgiveness. I would have put that one right after gratitude. You'll have to learn how to forgive yourself for your failures. My daughter, my daughter and the 21-year-old was talking to me a little bit a while ago about the internet. And you always have to be on. You never get to be off. You always have to present the best of yourself. And what that does is it creates a sense of expectancy of not knowing. There's a veil too, so people don't really know you. And there's no mercy on the internet. There's no forgiveness on the internet. People are mean. But then if you don't have the wherewithal to say, well, they don't know what they're talking about and disconnect, you can start to take that in. And so I think spirituality or practicing a faith helps you navigate those waters. Like, who am I? Am I a child of God? Is that what I believe? Who is my identity? And my purpose. Is my purpose to make them happy, or is my purpose to fulfill something else?
You know, as humans, we are driven by interconnectedness
Mm-hmm.
and community. And for me, one of the greatest gifts of faith and a practiced faith,
Yeah.
right, is the community that you are a part of.
Mm,
Uh, and, COVID threw us for a loop with how do we practice when we can't be together?
yep.
Um, and I would imagine that those in the military actually have been navigating this for a very long time, even though you may have formed a community of peers. It's still not the same community that you might have back home when you go out and you're deployed, right?
Yeah.
The faith community is different. Um, and I may be totally wrong with that because I am not I have not served, so I apologize for that. Not for not serving, but for if
Mm-hmm.
I misunderstand this.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that being deployed or having the potential of being deployed and having community back home and community elsewhere that maybe we can learn from that.
Yeah.
We the greater world,
Yeah.
can learn from what that means to find community when it arises. Much of the internet for me, I think, is people looking for community.
Mhm.
And because we're not face to face, we say things that we would never say to anyone.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
feel free to completely delete that.
I'll listen to it again and decide. But some of the things that you say are quite profound in that they just kind of roll off your tongue because you've been living with and walking with people in struggles and strifes and building community for quite some time. And I think that's one of the things that faith communities have always provided wherever they land is that sense of community. And I think it's also one of the things we're struggling with is we've created communities in a lot of nonprofits, which is wonderful because you can find your sense of purpose in it and your identity. The military's, an identity. It's your tribe. It can give you a sense of purpose, but it's not your all the end all, hopefully. People struggle with that from retiring from the military sometimes is, that retreading about who am I if I'm not this can be struggle.
Isn't separation one of the highest rates of suicide within the military when they actually retire? And like
Oh,
that first year as people are struggling with identity and finding that next purpose, I believe
yep.
AFSP now has a uh, individual on AFSP National. AFSP.org actually now has someone on staff who is a veteran who focuses only on supporting the military community and the veteran community, recognizing that the two are very different, and recently spoke to that 1 year period in separation from being active duty to retired, or actually just, you know, um, leaving the military, and
Yeah.
how it changes identity, how it change all the struggles associated with it.
Yeah. When you feel like you're floundering,
Mhm.
I know a lot of people, I know what their rank was in the military, and that's not the same level of respect that they get out in the civilian world. That's a struggle. When you can make people do things and now no one's going to listen to you because they don't care, that's a big struggle. Good for AFSP. One of the things I always appreciate about American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is the peer to peer that comes out of experience. And as you know, one of the things that people that are struggling with suicide and have contemplated or maybe have attempted suicide is they don't need someone telling them how to live. They want somebody walking with them, helping them to unpack it, which can take more time. That SAMHSA,
Mhm.
SAMSHA study, they did a study like, okay, what are we getting wrong for you people that, suicide might be on your radar screen as a possibility? And they're like, we want to be a co-care planners. We don't need professionals telling us what we're going through. We know what we're going through. We just need a way out or give us a road to help us live with,
Hmm.
work with us in that. And I think faith offers that.
I think faith offers community. Faith offers hope in the, faith in its faith offers hope in darkness.
Yeah.
Um, at least it does for me. I can't speak for other people, right? But
Right.
and when we are struggling, it is so easy to turn inward and become isolated.
Yeah.
Um, and this kind of goes back to your point about resiliency and gratitude, and my point about how I identify with a God who recognizes those, challenges that we face day in, day out, right? I've shared with you that I'm a brain injury survivor. There's no reason for me to be no medical reason for me to be alive. I have limited use of my right side, very dark days associated with it.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was a person of faith going into it, I had this incredible strength that I knew things would be okay, even if I didn't get to define what okay was. And, this isn't a commercial for faith. I would love for people to have faith. I also recognize it's a gift that not everyone has been able to find. But connection is important. So wherever you can do it, and I agree with you, one of the best things AFSP does is it is a team of volunteers, hundreds of thousands of volunteers, and maybe a few hundred staff members who are changing the world for the better. And peer-to-peer is what it's all about. And for me, if you go into many of the scriptures, not just the Christian scripture, but many of the scripture, there are peer-to-peer encounters with the holy, where the holy embodies a human form and makes that connection. So however you find that peer-to-peer, however you make that connection, good for you, and continue to strive doing it.
Yeah. Something that was very formational for me very early on was Dr. Yalom's work in group therapy. He got very curious about what makes groups work. What is about this group therapy thing that really clicks? And he narrowed it down through watching groups is we all have a desire to be known. We want to be known by another human being intimately, but we're so afraid of being known. So there's that paradox, right? Like, who do I get to be vulnerable with, and who can I trust my vulnerability with that can respect it? And, loneliness is that inability to venture into it. But then we know it enriches our lives. And so when you're feeling vulnerable, to some degree, you can keep retreating or you can lean into it. Is what that's informed me over the years. And so
I love that.
Thank you. You can see, and I know you can see people's questioning in their eyes, like, can I trust you? And in the military, it's a huge thing. If you understand anything about the military, you can never trust your seniors because you have to guard your own career path. And if there's any weakness, well, then you're removed. And they're still fighting that. So vulnerability is something that the military has struggled with throughout its career, if you will. Like, who do you get to be vulnerable with? But I think we're making strides I know in the American Legion and in many posts, creating these PTSD groups or creating suicide prevention groups where you get together and you can be vulnerable to the extent that you're able to, which builds that community, right?
Yeah. The best thing about community for me is like, I don't want you so much when things are good.
Right.
I mean, I want you, but boy, do I need you when things are bad.
Right. And come to me.
Yeah.
Come to me.
We
Know
talk
me enough.
a lot about meeting people where they are.
Yeah. Yep.
Everyone can do a better job with that.
Yeah.
Except for what you just highlighted in terms of, a group, right? A support group. You got to go to them, but
Right.
you physically have to go to them. But there's this but it's usually on a neutral ground or a shared space. And
Yep.
there's power in that. Oh, there's power in that.
Right, peer to peer. And I chose to do it, so I already have some level of willingness to be brought into this circle of vulnerability. And we all get our opportunity to do it or not do it. But not everyone is entitled. I think that's the other thing that the military knows so well is not everyone's entitled to know you. Not everyone can handle it. Sometimes they're going to go on Facebook now and they're just going to share and they're going to use your name. Oh, did you see so and so? And I think churches struggle with that too, especially if I can call it the church's prayer groups. You know, having permission to talk about somebody.
I think so. I've navigated this really interesting world most of my life as a person of faith, but also someone who has worked in the secular world. First in media, then I worked in the church world for about 12, 15 years, and now in higher ed. I think HIPAA was one of the greatest things that's come along for the simple fact that it requires permission for the most part to share.
And empower.
And I agree with you. I mean, I love the church.
Mm-hmm.
There can also be, the church is frequently filled with individuals who in their own way are very wounded as well.
Yep.
And they don't always act the best. And that can include telling someone else's story, which for me has really just kind of been highlighted in my own personal life of past 10, 15 years of how it's not my place to tell other people's stories, and how important it is to get that permission to do so, because every single one of us should be allowed to tell our story and not have someone else do so, because that is so damaging and so hurtful.
It's empowering to speak your story.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Yes.
To have to own your story.
Yeah.
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 I had cancer in 2011. I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. That's what took me out of the military. And the shock of what that meant to me was ongoing. And I didn't talk about it for quite some time because I didn't know what it meant to me. I knew that it ended a career that I suffered for 6 years. But our children also, I didn't tell them. We didn't tell them. But then I was like, no, I have to tell my story because I'm withholding something from them that they can feel, because we feel things and we can sense things. We don't always have to say things. They knew something was up. And then they were learning not to trust their gut because the parents weren't saying anything. So they struggled needlessly because of that. So that empowering tool of this is something that happened to me. It was part of my life story. And this is how it's impacted me. And those failures and those struggles were a part of my life. And so we've talked about that for many, many years, but it's just empowering to say it. Just like I'm a woman veteran. I didn't say I was a veteran for many years. Never considered the fact that I was a veteran. So it was quite empowering for me to recognize that part of my identity was in the veteran world too. And I think there's power in that. Can I claim that about my life? And so I don't really know where I want to go with that.
I would simply offer, and you're the one who gets to decide. Right?
Yes.
You know, that for a very long time, I didn't share brain injury survivor status. I mean, if you were to meet me, you would know that physically, just because the way I walk, shake hands, blah, blah, blah. But when I came to terms with it, right, because we have to come to terms with these things.
Yep.
And from my own mental health, I mean, I went from being a very physically active individual to someone who was not that person anymore. I had to carve out new ways to re-identify with that. And it challenged who I was. I mean, there was a period where I thought I would have to quit working. Well, heck, I thought I was going to die in 6 months, right? All
Right.
these things.
That,
And labeling others is not our role. Our role is to love and support people and let people decide their own labels and identity. That's what I mean by label there is
yeah.
identity. So,
Can I pick up on something that you were talking about when you were talking about your brain injury before? You were having to come to terms that you wouldn't necessarily be the one to define your future,
sure.
because that's the faith piece.
Yes.
You had to release or relinquish control of what your future would look like.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have something called an ABI, acquired brain injury, different from a TBI, right? Traumatic. So, acquired brain injury can be a virus, it could be a stroke, it could be whatever. Mine is actually undiagnosed. I had massive swelling at the base of my brain that was
Mm.
causing my body to shut down. And I was in the hospital for several days, and there was this moment where they come in and they say, "Hey, we're getting ready to start to do." I mean, I was at the point they were getting ready to put me on a respirator, and they were I was like, okay, that's cool. And they're like, no, you need to realize we're buying time at this point
Oh.
because your body is shutting down.
Mm.
And that was kind of like the things got real moment. And I was just kind of like, okay, I'm actually going to do this selfish prayer and ask for a miracle. And but I also knew that I had no control in this situation.
Mm.
And I preach the resurrection doesn't mean I'm excited for my own personal resurrection.
Right.
Totally cool with everyone else dying, not so much with my
Right.
but it but there was a sense of, well, okay.
Mm.
And not like a defeated okay, just okay. And that for me was the acceptance of, yep, I don't get to choose the when, the where, the what.
Oh, yeah.
It's just like life happens, and then God's there for us, right? And God was there for me. And I'm very thankful that I got that miracle.
Mm-hmm.
Without a doubt. I mean, I just had massive swelling in the brain. They couldn't figure out why. It was at the base of the brain. It
Mm-hmm.
was there for a year and a half, and then one day it was all gone. And when I was discharged, I couldn't walk. I could barely talk, had no use of my right side whatsoever. And living in the unknown is something that I've done for 17 years now, and it's okay.
Mm. Um, I can empathize with the release.
Yeah.
After they took the thyroid out, I went through a period of your body's adjusting, and I had no control over my energy levels. And so it was just drudgery to just get out of bed. I was able to work, and then I would come home and just fall asleep many nights. But I remember getting to, like, okay, Lord, I know you're with me in this, so it's okay however my life is going to turn out. I'm okay. I'm glad I'm alive. I've been told that thyroid cancer is one of the least invasive cancers ever. It didn't feel like that to me. It felt very life-changing. There was a lot I had to let go. but I knew I also wasn't alone, and I can't explain it. I just sensed it. I knew that within those moments where I just didn't know what tomorrow was going to bring, I wasn't alone. And I think that's valuable for human beings if we're willing to allow that to happen. There's many reasons why we don't, of course. And God hasn't always been so palpable in my life. You know, there's many days where I'm like, I know you're there, I just don't feel you. Don't
Oh,
sense you. Like, show up for me, please. I need you to show up now. And no, silence.
there's still days when I'm like, is this real?
Exactly.
You know, and that's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. That's why it's faith and not belief.
Yeah. Because if we knew it, well, then it wouldn't be faith.
Right.
I think we struggle with that in our country today, and maybe around in our world, is how are you going to prove something that is a little bit bigger than us?
We struggle with that in so many ways, right?
Yep.
You know, I work on a college campus, and many people think college campuses are like completely secular, and they are anything but. There is great space allowed for people who choose
Right.
to observe or explore. Um, I think the challenge in our country and in the world is that there is the idea that there's actually only one right faith,
Right.
whether it be X, Y, or Z, right?
Yep.
God is allowed to manifest God's self in whatever way God chooses. Many of our faiths require us to believe that there's one path, and that's okay. I got no problem with that, you know, right? But if we start thinking that there's only one God, or if I need to be careful here because you get into the world of heresy, right? But if,
Yep.
so I'll just say it
Yep.
without being heretical. As a Christian, I believe a certain way, right?
Yep.
And as a person who appreciates the religions of the world, if I were to simply say, well, we're all just walking up the same mountain, just taking a different path, I would not acknowledge the beauty of each of those religions and their traditions and their faiths. I just simply disagree with what that ultimate deity is, right? So, and that's fine, right? I don't have to be right. God tells me that I've chosen the right path for me. Sorry, not the right path. That's a bad language there after my analogy, but no, I'm just comfortable where I am. And I know other people who, you know, through interfaith dialogues, they're comfortable where they are and agree to disagree and accept that because all of us are part of a community that is called to love.
And loving requires this selflessness. When I was on a hospice chaplain, one of the most beautiful stories that I carry with me and still makes me giggle a little bit is a Catholic man raised a Roman Catholic his whole life, died on in the emergency room. And so he shares his death experience that he saw the white light and he went to it, and it was the most peaceful thing he's ever experienced. And he said, and you know what? I saw Chaplain. And I'm like, what? He said, we're all a bunch of cattle. So he was a farmer. And so to him, what he saw was multitude of people from varying faith groups, from varying walks of life. He's like, we're all loved by the same. And so, but then his wife was yelling at him in the emergency room because she wasn't ready to let him go. And he goes, and then I heard my wife's voice. And I'm like, do I have to go back? And he knew, he's like, yeah, I have to go back. So he came back. But it changed his perspective for the rest of his life that he lived on earth. He was the most loving individual. And it was one of the only reasons that he let me in because I was a female chaplain. And he's like, that's not how I was raised, but God loves you too.
Fantastic.
Um, what that tells me is there's so many things that are beyond my control. And if I can just learn to love other people, no matter who they are and where they're at, right? That's enough for the day. Sometimes I have enough time loving myself.
Oh, I'm
Right?
awful at that. I'm
Uh,
actually so much better loving my neighbor than myself. Like I am like the biggest critic of myself.
oh,
Right.
does that voice in your head tell you how
Well,
terrible?
right. I mean, all of us, like someone will say, "Hey, good job," and in my mind, it's like, "Well, I could have done this better, or I could have done this, or something like that." Right.
Yep.
And,
Yep.
and that's why I really like and love your neighbor as I have loved you.
Oh, there you go.
Because I'm not that good at loving myself.
No.
I'm actually really good at tearing myself down
Yeah.
or saying I'm not worthy or I'm not enough.
I listened to a person who doesn't prefer, her main language is not voice, verbal. And she challenged all of us to think about the sound of our, how did she put it? Let me think about this again. What do you hear every day?
Hmm.
And so of course, we went to the sounds, the birds are chirping, the lawn's getting mowed. She goes, okay, now, um, what do you sound like to yourself? What does what does your mind sound like to you? What does anger sound like? Your emotions. And that put a whole new spin on it for me. It's like, do I sound nice to myself? Well, a lot of times I'm not. I'm kind of mean. And yeah, I don't know if that's a good thing. Well, it's a thing, it's a process.
You know, God said these amazing words
Hmm.
that one day I want to believe, and it's, "You are my beloved, and with you I am well pleased."
Yeah, this helped my unbelief.
Yeah.
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 Um, Go ahead.
I I have this one nagging thought about gratitude,
Uh-huh.
right?
Okay.
I love gratitude. I call it prayer,
Okay.
right? It's just kind of like, and I'm a big U Penn fan because I went to college in Philadelphia, may have gone to college at a certain university that was just mentioned, or not.
Could
Um,
have.
but the I struggle with when people co-opt faith or our practices, right? It's like, and then put a new name on it, right? It's kind of like, yeah, okay. You call it gratitude, I call it prayer. So, but and for your viewers and your listeners, whatever you call it, just do it because it brings a certain lightness in our life and in our day.
We are engaged in a lot of the same practices, and depending upon our discipline, yeah, we change the language a bit. Um, oh, shoot. It'll come back. Now I'm gonna have to edit something out for myself because I just totally forgot you were talking about. Oh, religious equity. Was talking with a lovely lady, and she was wanting religious equity in our practices that the hospitals and the mental health fields engage in. And but her point, because she comes from a Christian faith, is, um, and she was conversing with these individuals, and they were just talking about the very fact that they have a separation of church and state, which is, anyway, that's a confusion in itself. But she's like, well, you already practice mindfulness, meditation, and yoga, which are religious practices. They're philosophies too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But she's like, but prayer has also been researched and proven to be effective. And so, but you don't allow that as a modality that you can prescribe to your patients, which is religious inequity. So her field is religious equity, which I never thought about it that way before. It's like, oh, interesting. So we're venturing into this field that we've never ventured before, and she's appreciating the role of prayer, gratitude.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's something to think about on a 60-mile bike ride tomorrow.
There you go. Are you going on a 60-mile bike ride tomorrow?
Well, I've said it, so now I have to, right?
Yeah, now you have to, because I'm going
But
to check.
I actually was only planning 45, but now I've said it, so yeah, okay. Guess I'll do 60.
Tomorrow's supposed to be gorgeous, Tristan.
It is. It is. Um, there was one other thing that I wanted to make sure that I got in here
Uh-huh.
before we wrap up.
Okay.
And like this whole conversation about the world religions and where one fits, right? You know, we
Right.
went through that rabbit hole. Um, and you shared that lovely story about the man that you were able to be with. Um, and thank you for sharing that. And also thank you for talking about your cancer experience. Um, because I think both those give power to others to articulate similar instances, right? So
Oh.
thank you for doing that. Someone once said to me, "Just love everyone and let God sort it out." I was like, man, because I can be a judgy son of a gun at times, right? Especially with people with whom I disagree. It's like, oh no. But that really has opened my eyes to like how I approach many things, especially in the world of suicide and um, faith. Uh, a good example of that is personally, so this is a me thing, right? I
Okay.
am totally cool with the trans community. I also recognize that there are many people of faith who are where that is a real challenge in gender identity, right? Um, I heard something the other day where, um, not heard, I was at a conference and it was shared that 40% of those who identify as trans will attempt suicide in their lifetime.
It's a big number.
Huge number.
Yeah.
If that was white people, if that was black people, if that was whatever, we would be, there would be no question about supporting that community, especially from the faith community standpoint. So it has been something where, as a faith leader, have really started speaking more and more about that intersectionality and how, as we as people of faith, need to make sure that we are reaching out to those who are on the margins, no matter how they identify, because these statistics are absolutely unacceptable. And we can offer them something that might be missing in their lives when they feel that, people are not understood.
Thank you.
So.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because you started out talking about, for you, God knew you.
Yeah.
God knew you.
Yeah.
Before,
Made in God's image.
made in God's image. And how do we define that? It changes throughout human history of how we define, but now we're into and I think we've always been what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. That high school days of who's in the clique and who's not in the clique
Yeah.
never goes away. And who we withhold our love from and who we withhold forgiveness and grace to, we define it. And for those in the Christian faith, Jesus didn't put monikers on it. And that, I think that's a challenge. Just be aware of where your barriers are and your preferences are, and then challenge yourself to move into, what does love look like to that person? How do I love that person? How do I extend kindness?
That'll preach.
It certainly could, and it could bring hope and it could bring community, right?
I would also share with your community who's following this that if you identify as a person of faith, specifically Christian, I would remind you of one of Paul's teachings where they will know you by your deeds.
Oh,
And
oh,
that, what?
oh, the Reverend in you came out.
Well, I mean, just going to where we were, because that is something that I struggle with. Like, as I've shared, the the idea of loving everyone, it is so hard to love those that, in this world, we demonize people. We don't just dislike people. 10 years ago, we disliked people. Now we are demonizing people.
Yeah.
Uh, and as a person of faith, I need to remind myself that they will know me by my deeds,
Yeah.
right? They will
Yeah.
know I'm a Christian by my deeds. Oof, that's an eye opener.
Yes. And you've probably studied all the major world religions, and I think every major world religion has teaching on that
Yeah.
for that human element of forgiveness, mercy, kindness, those definitions of love. And I think all of our sacred scriptures will have experiences where there's enough evidence where you have human beings killing one another, and doing so in God's name. Yes, and some of us will lean heavily into that, and some of us are struggling with that, and some of us, demonize because of that. Um, but I think the human need in all of us is to be loved and to be known.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that'll just make you weep when you think about it, right? Because the vulnerability and the smallness that we feel when we feel that we are not loved, when we are not worthy of someone's loved, um, and how does that manifest itself?
Yep. I we've been talking for
Oh,
just over an hour.
you have a
Um,
lot of editing.
Maybe I'll just let it go, Tristan. One of the things that hit me is this world is a challenging place for all of us
Hmm.
to become more of who God created us to be. And sometimes the world will just kind of pummel you back into not evidencing that truth. And love are the ways that we can manifest who we are more and more. Like, can we grow in love? Can we grow in grace? I mean, you've probably preached enough times on that of growing and developing and allowing that. But to put growing in more of who God created you to be is loving more, giving more, sacrificing more for another human being. That to me changed how I thought about it. It's like, oh, okay. So I just need to strength-based model that, just
Yeah.
be more of this and not focus so much on the weaknesses of, how I beat myself up on the head. Just maybe just love some more.
There's nothing wrong with that, right?
Right. I'm
Because
gonna
when
let,
you do that, you're living for others.
hopefully some days,
Yeah, right?
right?
Yeah.
Some days I'm like, no, it's my day.
I like to think I get it right occasionally.
Everyone's, yeah,
Yeah, it's pretty rare when I get it right. A whole day right. Uh,
yeah,
but yeah.
yeah. I'll let you have the last word, um, or words or thought.
Well, I guess one thing that I would really want to make sure that I want people to hear who have been impacted by suicide
Mhm.
and feel that the church has left them. I would just simply want you to know that I'm sorry that is your experience.
Yeah.
God has not left you. The construct made by man may have failed you, but I hope you know that you are chosen, that you are marked, and that you are loved by God. And God knows your pain and your suffering. And I hope that in the days ahead, you can find a way to reconcile that connection. And if you've never had one, I hope that you have the opportunity to seek it out because it can be terribly rewarding to have that comfort in your life.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing this.